Good morning, Dan. And in for Amy this morning is the beautiful John Cass. And John, a lot of...
love staring into your eyes right before a broadcast, man.
It's a nice moment.
Okay.
We've got a lot of national security issues to address, particularly as President Trump is addressing the masses in Poland, talking about national security and talking about whether the West has the interest to save Western civilization or not.
Does the West have the will to survive is something that is of vital interest to Dan Proft and me. I don't know if it's of the interest of many of the people in our business who really don't like the West.
Well,
I certainly do.
Well, and the new threat is, which is one of the axis of evil countries, as George W. called them, and that would include North Korea, has amped up their capacity, it appears this week, with an ICBM that allegedly, and according to reports the U.S. believes, could strike Alaska, has the capacity for that kind of distance. And so the reaction from the administration to that has been received has been received in an underwhelmed fashion from the likes of Charles Krauthammer, admittedly a neocon, but nonetheless, the response of our kind of doing exercises with South Korea didn't impress, and there are increasing calls for, including from our ambassador to the UN, Nikki Haley, and calls and suggestions that military action is not off the table and it may be moving to the front of the table. Here's Krauthammer the other day on the North Korea missile tests and the U.S. response.
I think it's rather embarrassing that we should have had this immediate release of the video from the U.S. as a response. What the North Koreans have done is to cross the Rubicon. I mean, this is a entirely new phase. Once they have an intercontinental ballistic missile, they're obviously going to want to put a nuke on top. We're in a totally different world. And the video showing that we can have a surface-to-surface missile go 200 miles is a pathetic response. If we still had the tactical nukes that we withdrew in 1991, that would be a serious threat. That would be a way of saying, you mess with us, we can have in place, in theater, tactical nukes that can hit your capital and your other assets. But in the absence of that, it's a very weak response.
Well,
does a neocon ever see a war they don't like?
Well,
the discussion of tactical nukes, such an offhanded way, sitting in a chair on a broadcast. I don't know. That's where.
Well, the issue is deterrence, right?
Probably.
Not necessarily usage. I mean, it's the same discussion we would have since Trump is in Poland right now, before he goes off to the G20 in Hamburg. It's the same discussion about the missile defense system we had in Poland as a bulwark against the Russians.
Oh, what happened to that? Is that the one that Obama led the Poland into? No, Bush had us into it, and then Obama just turned his back on them.
Well,
turned his back on the
right.
Polish people.
The good policy decisions in terms of our national security interests, or poor ones. For answers to those questions, we're pleased to be joined again by our friend Colonel Cedric Leighton. He is a military intelligence expert and security consultant who's worked for both NSA and Joint Chiefs of Staff. Colonel Leighton, thanks for joining us again. Appreciate it.
You bet, Dan. Good morning.
Why don't we start with North Korea and your reaction to Krauthammer's reaction?
Well, I think Charles Krauthammer is obviously a heavyweight in terms of journalism and an opinion maker for many people. But what I would say in this case is this: the way in which the responses have to be crafted now, you have to be based on reality. And it's nice to think about having tactical nukes and use them for certain things. But the reality of the situation is that those are dangerous weapons. And they were withdrawn, not by the Trump administration. It happened way before that. But they were withdrawn for reasons of safety, in part, but mainly for for reasons of trying to tamp down on the threat that existed on the Korean Peninsula, and that was perhaps a failed policy or a mistaken policy, but nonetheless that was the hand that the president was dealt, and in terms of what kind of a response do you give something like an ICBM launch from the North Koreans, I think we're just seeing the very beginning of that. So, I think Mr. Krauthammer and others need to take a look at exactly what is possible, and also realize that this is just the beginning of how we're going to respond to this particular situation.
So I agree with you that cavalier talk about nuclear weapons is often not the thing I want to hear. But where do the refugees go? The North Korean refugees into China. How does that fear of refugees or destabilization there impact China's resolve in dealing with this when they're doing so well in our trade with the United States? Where's the leverage for China on this thing?
John, that's precisely the heart of the problem. For the Chinese, they love stability on their border because they want to keep economic stability within their country. And anytime there's an issue that upsets that, such as the potential for massive flows of refugees from North Korea into northeastern China, that could change the entire dynamic of at least that regional economy within China, but it could also upset the entire process that they've established to make themselves a preeminent trading nation. So the Chinese have a vested interest in keeping a lid on North Korea, but also on making sure that North Korea is stable enough that not so many people go across the border and in a refugee flow like this.
Well, but it doesn't seem like they're doing a bang-up job, the Chinese, of stability.
Oh, no, they are certainly not. They're certainly not, and so that's part of the issue. They are kind of feeling their way through this, and they have many challenges that they have to deal with, and because of that, their responses are not necessarily going to be ones that we would like to see.
Well, so I guess the question, and this question was raised before this missile test with the murder of Otto Warmbier at the hands of the North Koreans. What to do about this rogue regime? I mean, do we send in special ops units to turn the lights off in Pyongyang? What is the next level response to this apparent lunatic that is the head of the North Korean totalitarian state? I don't think it's Dennis Rodman. That's not working either.
Yeah, Dennis Rodman, is an interesting ambassador, I'll say, but not really an ambassador, and not really somebody who can bring the kinds of things that we need out of North Korea. So the murder of Otto Warmbier was a significant issue. It's a personal issue, obviously, for the Warmbier family, but it also shows the brutality of the North Korean regime. And lest anybody doubt the idea that these people are in fact incredibly brutal, that was proof enough that they are in fact beyond the pale when it comes to being a part of the world as it exists today. So as far as our options go, special operations forces and inserting them in North Korea would potentially be an option, but it's an extremely difficult option, extremely hard to do. This is one of the most sealed-off countries in the world. We talk about securing our borders. Their borders are, for all intents and purposes, quite secured. And the fact that they are very insular, not only in terms of that policy of theirs, but also in terms of their ethnic makeup, makes it very difficult for foreigners of any type, including South Koreans, to actually go in there and conduct sabotage operations. But they are certainly an option, but they would be very difficult to undertake.
But he might meet with a delegation of Chinese businessmen who have staff, correct?
Well, there always are possibilities, but one of the things that they've also looked at in
Ross Perot of China, yeah.
would be cyber options against North Korea. The only problem with that is that North Korea is not that connected to the internet, and that creates significant issues in terms of the kinds of effects that one wants to have when you go after a country like this.
Colonel, he assassinated his brother, and he wiped out, from what I understand, all the people his older brother knew in North Korea. So how do you get to How do you get to it physically?
That is exactly the issue. He would be, first of all, it would take a presidential finding to actually go in and do what amounts to a decapitation strike in terms of the terminology, not the actual physical effect. But that would be it would be a difficult thing to do both legally as well as from an operational perspective. He'd be very difficult to get at because he is one of the most protected leaders on the planet.
Yeah.
And
Cass wants to go back to the 70s when we used to have CIA take
no,
out
that would be
heads of state.
I don't want the CIA to do anything. I'm encouraging the China to
you want to use a
its,
cutout. Like the Chicago way. Chicago way.
It is. Yeah. What? I did write a column exactly on that. The Chinese should handle this business.
Well, let me, Colonel Leighton, let me switch gears because Trump is meeting with Putin tomorrow, and that's much anticipated given the swirl about Russian collusion the left is still prosecuting in this country. And yesterday, a statement from Secretary of State Rex Tillerson, on the situation in Syria seemed to indicate an openness to working with Russia to enforce no-fly zones in Syria. Now, this is a bit complicated because there was also the belief that Russia was previously providing interference for Assad to commit atrocities against his own people, so they seem like a surprising ally in this matter in Syria. But now the flip side is you even have like the likes of David Ignatius in the Washington Post saying cooperation with Russia could be the right step towards peace in Syria. So suss this out for us.
So the basic idea is you pick the lesser of two or three evils, and there are many more evils in Syria at the present time than just two or three. But the idea would be that Syria would be a place where Russia could have a degree of influence. It would be recognized by the United States. They would get to keep a base there. They have a naval base on the Mediterranean. They also have an air base that they use. So they would get to keep those. They would also get a chance to keep the Assad regime in power because they did aid and abet the regime in maintaining that power. And what that would then do is, the condition should be, in my opinion, that Assad is removed from power in a case like that, and that other elements of the Syrian population, in essence, get their own countries. So it would mean the partitioning of Syria. Whether or not that actually happens is something that I'm not sure people in Washington or other places have thought through at the present time, but that is precisely where we're heading if we're not coming up with any other alternatives. So the idea would be a recognized Russian sphere of influence, but there would be a degree of Kurdish independence, which would then upset the Turks. There would be a degree of Sunni independence, so that the Sunnis could maintain their own government, their own society.
That would upset Iran. So
and then you'd have the Shiite, the Iranian forces. They back the Alawites, who are a Shiite offshoot, and that's the sect that Assad belongs to. So the Iranians would want to exercise influence, which would run counter to what the Saudis and the Qataris want to do in Syria. But the Russians would, of course, support the Iranians and the Assad regime. So this mess basically boils down to this: in order to end the fighting, all sides have to agree to end the fighting, and that usually happens when they're exhausted and don't see any other alternative. And the fight against ISIS, which is just one aspect of the Syrian mess, that is one thing that has to be taken care of. But I don't think that the Russians can really help with that because they're not really targeting ISIS. for the most part. But what they can do is they can put a stop if they get the right incentives. They could potentially put a stop to what the Assad regime is doing to its own people.
And perhaps leave everybody kind of moderately satisfied and moderately dissatisfied, and that's the way you strike a deal with all these complications and all these players. He is Colonel Cedric Leighton, military intelligence expert and security consultant who formerly worked for both Joint Chiefs of Staff as well as NSA. Colonel Leighton, thanks as always for joining us. Appreciate it.
It's my pleasure, Dan. Thanks so much for having me.
And he joined us on the Turnkey.Pro answer line.
It's news.